Random House Audio presents The Last Stand of the Tin Can Sailors by James D. Hornfischer. Read for you by Grover Gardner. October 25th, 1944. San Bernardino Strait, the Philippines. A giant stalked through the darkness. In the moonless calm after midnight, the great fleet seemed not so much to navigate the narrow strait as to fill it with armor and steel. Barely visible even to a night-trained eye, the long silhouettes of 23 warships passed in a column 10 miles long, guided by the dim glow of the channel lights in the passage threading between the headlands of Luzon and Samar. That such a majestic procession should move without challenge was surprising, inexplicable even, in light of the vicious reception the Americans had already given it on its journey from Borneo to this critical point. Having weathered submarine ambush the night before and assault by wave after wave of angry blue aircraft the previous afternoon, Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, steward of the last hopes of the Japanese Empire, would have been right to expect the worst. But then Kurita knew that heavenly influences could be counted upon to trump human planning. In war, events seldom cooperate with expectation. Given the dependable cruelty of the divine hand, most unexpected of all, perhaps, was this fact. Unfolding at last after more than 2 years of retreat, Japan's ornate plan to defend the Philippines appeared to be working perfectly. For its complexity, for its scale, for its extravagantly optimistic over-elegance, the show plan represented the very best and also the very worst tendencies of the Imperial Navy. The Japanese military's fondness for bold strokes had been evident from the earliest days of the war. The sudden strike on Pearl Harbor, the sprawling offensive into the Malay Peninsula, the lightning thrust into the Philippines, and the smaller but no less swift raids on Wake Island, Guam, Hong Kong, and northern Borneo. Allied commanders believed the Japanese could not tackle more than one objective at a time. The sudden spasm of advances of December 1941, in which Japan struck with overwhelming force in 8 directions at once, refuted that fallacy. The show plan's audacity, orchestrating the movements of 4 fleets spread across thousands of miles of ocean and the land-based aircraft necessary to protect them, was both its genius and its potentially disastrous weakness. Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, leading the remnants of Japan's once glorious naval air arm, would steam south from Japan with his aircraft carriers and try to lure the American fast carrier groups north, away from Leyte. With the U.S. flat-tops busy pursuing the decoy, 2 Japanese battleship groups would close on Leyte from the north and south and deal MacArthur a surprise, killing blow. Admiral Kurita had departed Brunei on October 22nd with his powerful center force, led by the Yamato and the Musashi, the 2 largest warships afloat, aiming to slip across the South China Sea, pass through San Bernardino Strait above Samar Island, and close on the Leyte beachhead from the north. Meanwhile, the southern force, led by Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura and supported by Vice Admiral Kiyo Hideshima, would cross the Sulu Sea and approach Leyte from the south through Surigao Strait. On the morning of October 25th, after their 1,000-mile journeys through perilous waters, Kurita's and Nishimura's battleship groups would rendezvous at 9 a.m. off Leyte Island's eastern shore, encircling the islands like hands around a throat. Then they would turn their massive guns on MacArthur's invasion force. Japan would at last win the decisive battle that had eluded it in the 28 months since the debacle at Midway. Kurita's grandfather had been a great scholar of early Meiji literature. His father, too, had been a distinguished man of learning, author of a magisterial history of his native land. In the morning, Takeo Kurita, who preferred action to words, would make his own contribution. Off Samar. Gathered around the radio set in the Combat Information Center of the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, they listened as 100 miles to their south, their heavier counterparts in the 7th Fleet encountered the first signs that the Japanese defense of the Philippines was underway. There was no telling precisely what their countrymen faced. It was something big, that much was for sure. And yet, until the scale of the far-off battle became too apparent to ignore, they would pretend it was just another midwatch. By the routine indications, it was. They watched the radar scopes, and the scopes watched back, bathing the darkened compartment in cathode green fluorescence, but revealing no enemy nearby. The Southwest Pacific slept. But something was on the radio, and it put the lie to the silent night. As the American liberation of the Philippines unfolded, the Greenhorn enlistees who made up the majority of the Samuel B. Roberts's 224-man complement could scarcely have guessed at the scope of the drama to come. On the midnight to 4 a.m. midwatch, the Roberts's skipper, Lieutenant Commander Robert W. Copeland, his executive officer, Lieutenant Everett E. Bob Roberts, his communications officer, Lieutenant Tom Stevenson, and the young men under them in the little ship's Combat Information Center, CIC, had little else to do than while away the night as the destroyer escort zigzagged lazily off the eastern coast of Samar with the 12 other ships of its task unit, the small northernmost contingent of the sprawling 7th Fleet. When morning warmed the eastern horizon, the daily routine would begin anew, run through morning general quarters, then edge closer to shore with the 6 light aircraft carriers that were the purpose of the flotilla's existence, and launch airstrikes in support of the American troops advancing into Leyte Island. With a mixture of pride and resignation, the men of the 7th Fleet called themselves MacArthur's Navy. The unusual arrangement that placed the powerful armada under Army command was the product of the long-standing inter-service rivalry. The two service branches, each wildly successful, were beating divergent paths to Tokyo. From June 1943 to August 1944, MacArthur's forces had leapfrogged across the southern Pacific, staging 87 successful amphibious landings in a drive from Dutch New Guinea and west by northwestward across a 1,000-mile swath of islanded sea to the foot of the Philippine archipelago. Simultaneously, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz's fast carrier groups, accompanied by battle-hardened Marine divisions, had driven across the Central Pacific. The perpetual motion of the American industrial machine had built a naval and amphibious arsenal of such staggering size, range, and striking power that the vast sea seemed to shrink around it. Our naval power in the Western Pacific was such that we could have challenged the combined fleets of the world, Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr. would write in his memoirs. The rival commanders had used it so well that the Pacific Ocean was no longer large enough to hold their conflicting ambitions. There was little of the Pacific left to liberate. Behind them lay conquered ground. Ahead, looking westward to the Philippines and beyond, was a short, watery vista bounded by the shores of Manchuria, China, and Indonesia. Once the Far East had seemed a world away. Allied soldiers, Marines, sailors, and airmen operating along the far Pacific Rim early in the war. The Flying Tigers in China, the U.S. Asiatic Fleet in Java, the Marines on Wake Island, the defenders of Bataan and Corregidor, were consigned to oblivion, so desperately far from home. Now that U.S. forces had crossed that world, the greatest challenge was to agree on how to deliver the inevitable victory as quickly as possible. It had been nearly 3 years since Bataan fell and the American Caesar MacArthur fled that haunted peninsula by night aboard a PT boat, arrived in Mindanao, and boarded a B-17 bomber for Australia to endure the exile of the defeated. On March 20th, 1942, at a press conference at the Adelaide train station, he declared, "The President of the United States ordered me to break through the Japanese lines for the purpose, as I understand it, of organizing the American offensive against Japan, a primary object of which is the relief of the Philippines. I came through, and I shall return." Torn from context and conflated to a national commitment, "I shall return" became MacArthur's calling card and his albatross. For the general, fulfilling his famous promise to the Philippine people was not solely a question of military strategy, but also a point of personal and national honor. He told his president of the backlash in public opinion that might arise if the United States abandoned 17 million loyal Filipinos to their Japanese conquerors. And the lives of some 3,700 Americans
Sample complete. Ready to continue?